Hello everybody and welcome back to Planet Zoo, the beginner's guide, and we are just admiring our wonderful black-tailed prairie dogs scuttling around here that we put in back in episode 2. Now we're looking at these because we are starting to wrap up this series as the beginner's guide focus of this series. We'll be continuing to build on the zoo in live streams, I hope. But to round out this series, I actually want to move away from franchise mode settings to talk all about sandbox settings today. So anyone playing in sandbox mode, we're going to run through every setting that you can get and explain what they do, why you might want to include these settings, so that you can fully understand the capabilities of the game and what is actually possible, and it may shape how you want to play it, and it can add a lot of fun as well. So let's dive right in, and we've got a whole bunch of warnings here. So vending machine has broken down, wonderful. Let's go and send a mechanic to that. So that's one of the ones that we put right at the start of the zoo with our Nile monitors. Quarantine is full and staff are queuing. Now that is because we have a whole load of mute swans in there at the moment, which I'm going to come on to, because we're actually going to be using some of the sandbox settings I take you through today to put in a swan habitat in a little bit of a different fashion to what we've done elsewhere in the zoo. But before we come on to that, I'm going to pause and we're going to come into our settings menu. So if you are playing on Sandbox, you will have this settings here. Now some of these are available in franchise mode, so I'll go through all of them. Just a note up here at the top as well, so you can save this as a custom preset. So you can see in here there's various different presets already available for you, and then you can save your own if you want to. So it could be a preset for a certain zoo, and if you've got multiple zoos running with different settings and different options for your animals, then you can save them in here. So that's super useful. So this I've just got individual zoo settings, it's just what I have chosen to set up. And then there are various different options here. So you've got animal settings, which includes the habitat settings as well, guests, economy, and staff. So we're going to run through all of these. So animal settings is probably the most interesting and where you can make really the most dynamic changes to your zoo. So going from the top, we've got a category here called life cycle. And the first one is animal welfare. So if it's turned off, animals' total welfare will be 100% regardless of any welfare subcategory values, but they can still die. So that you've still got animal life cycle on essentially, but it means that this value here, this welfare value, will be 100% regardless. So right, we're going to zoom in on this little tiny penguin here, FewCandy, juvenile, 2.9 years old. So for some reason he's not 100%, so he is missing hard shelter. Yeah, probably because we've got 1,000 million penguins in this habitat and the shelter just is no longer actually big enough for them. So if we use this as an example, we'll come back into settings and we're going to turn off animal welfare. We'll click apply here. You do have to click apply after every change, otherwise it won't happen. We'll click OK. We'll just let the game play just a tiny bit and you'll see that is now 100%. So you can still see the individual settings in each of these categories within here. So hard shelter is still at 81, but it doesn't matter because their overall welfare is sitting at that 100% there. So if you want to be super creative with your habitats, maybe you want to put animals that don't like each other, animals that don't have enough space, animals that have the wrong plants, you want to go full hog, then that is the easiest setting for you to adjust in here to make sure that your animals are still happy regardless of anything else you do. So we're going to turn that back on. I like to play with animal welfare. I think having some game mechanics in there is pretty important. But that is kind of an overarching one that will essentially make the animals happy no matter what you do. And then we come on to animal death. Pretty self-explanatory. If you turn this off, no animals are going to die, so they're going to live forever. And sometimes that can be nice, but obviously you've got to bear in mind you're still going to have animal aging and birth on. So you're still going to have babies coming in and you'll get massive overcrowding. So honestly, I probably don't recommend that unless of course you have actually turned off animal aging and birth as well. So if you turn this off, that means animals are going to stay the same age forever, which is actually really useful. So once you've got animals in, you've let it play for a bit and they've had some babies, let's say, then you could turn this off and you're going to stay with that set of animals and that set of babies. And you're basically not going to worry about breeding at all, essentially, because pregnancies aren't going to advance, you're not going to get any more babies, you're not going to have to manage the number of animals in your habitat. So it can be useful if you're kind of sick of having to constantly stop overcrowding and sell your animals. You might want to consider using that. Now the flip side of this is that it doesn't stop animals from dying through illness. It obviously would stop it through old age because they're not aging anymore. So you may want to couple that up with things like turning off animal illness, like this setting up above here, or indeed turning off animal death. You might want to do all of that. Now the enable animal welfare will not do any of these things, so they're still going to die, they're still going to get ill, they're still going to age, they're still going to give birth. So the animal welfare is slightly different. That is purely that happiness and the welfare of the animals. We talked about this actually earlier in the season, but you can reduce the animal aging rate. So I always have this at 5 because I just find with my detailing mentality in this game, I spend a long time placing lots of tiny little props and buildings and things like that. And then by the time I've done that, the animals have had 20,000 million babies and it's too much for me to cope with. So I slow down that aging rate. So it just means that they're not going to have less babies, but the babies are going to take longer to grow up. Pregnancies are going to take longer for the babies to then come. It will take longer before the animals die as well. So it just buys you a little bit of extra time. And you can change this up or down by whatever factor you want. I generally, like to have it at the highest, but you might go somewhere in the middle if you wanted to. And then again, coupled with these ones above, we have enable death through aging. Of course, if you have turned off aging and birth, then that's not going to matter whatsoever. So if you turn that off, it'll still stay ticked, but it's not going to do anything. But you could turn that off again, and that would mean they'd never die of old age. But similar to this one, so this one is essentially they're never going to die of illness or old age or predation, I guess. I'm not actually sure if that would be the case. I would assume so. I'm going to come on to that in a minute. But again, there's kind of multiple options here where you can shape how long your animals live for, whether they get ill, whether they have babies, all that kind of stuff. And I'd really recommend coming in here and having a little play around. If you're unsure of what your playstyle is in planetzoo, these can be really super flexible and can be a lot of fun to play with. So the next category we're going on to is social welfare. Now, of course, this isn't going to matter. If you've turned off enable animal welfare, none of this is going to matter because they're going to be 100% regardless. But I think that's the brilliant thing about it, is there's kind of that overall welfare management, and then you can manage individual things here as well. So if you're getting a lot of warnings of animal stress, so I get this with my skunks a lot. So they don't like the crowds of people outside their habitat, and in fact let's head on over there and we can take a little look at our skunks. So yeah, here's their habitat, and there's a lot of guests that congregate outside here. There's a big wide viewing platform for people to see inside, but they do then have quite a large backstage area which is completely private and away from the guests. And there you can see we have got 2 skunks hiding out here already. So if you want to stop those pop-ups saying your guests are getting stressed, this is what you want to do here. Enable animal stress, turn that off and they won't get stressed. Enable social groups is also really useful as well. So basically that means if you've got a limitation, say, you know, with certain animals you're only allowed 2 of them in a habitat, you could turn this off and then you could actually have a few more. Or it might mean you can't have more than 1 male in a habitat, so you could turn this off and then you could have a few more males, and the animals aren't going to be stressed or unhappy about that. So that's something to bear in mind there. Enable overcrowding, again that's a space requirement thing. So if we come into here and we have a look, we'll click on our raccoon. So actually he's an outsider but integrating. So with raccoons you can have outsiders that are not part of that social group, but because he's part of the correct gender ratio for our raccoons in here, so you can't have more than 2 male raccoons in this case, then he's actually okay. So if we come into here, we've got space requirements here. Let's come back into settings and we can turn off overcrowding. We'll click apply, click OK, and you'll see when we come back and click on a raccoon, these are all greyed out now. So it means you could have tiny little habitats which aren't very nice, and or maybe not enough water, for example, and you can then build the habitat of your dreams. Maybe it's not ethically appropriate to, but you can build the habitat of your dreams and not worry about space for your animals. So quite useful in that sense. Let's turn that back on. Enable animal injuries, that's pretty self-explanatory. So if you have too many males, for example, is usually the case in your habitats, then they're going to fight and they'll get injured, so you could turn this off here. And again, enable animal fights, go hand in hand, they're never going to fight with each other. Now the final one in this section is a really interesting one. Enable animal predation and fear. So at the moment, you could very freely put in warthogs with lions into the same habitat. And what will happen, and I've done this, and it's a lot of fun, what will happen is the lions will, when they get hungry, hunt the warthogs and they will kill them. And the warthogs will run around fleeing from the lions. It's actually, I want to say it's kind of funny. It was funny to my 5-year-old son when we did it, and he asked me to when we were playing planetzoo. It is a natural cause of life. But what it does mean as well is you could create the safari park of your dreams, essentially, and you could put all of your African animals, let's use that as an example, all of your African animals, including the predators, so things like lions, cheetahs, the more dangerous animals, in with all of the less dangerous animals, and they're all going to hunt each other exactly like in the wild. It's super fun. I would really, really honestly recommend at some point in your Planet Zoo playing career to do something like that. But of course, if you don't want them to hunt each other and you just want them to live nicely together, so you want a lions and a warthog's habitat where the lions are never going to hunt down your warthogs, then you can turn this off and they're never going to predate other animals or run away. So the warthogs will just sit there next to a lion, no sweat whatsoever. So a lot of fun there. Coming on to the next category is habitat welfare. So these are pretty self-explanatory and these are quite useful as well if you want to play really in creative mode. So we've got enable water cleanliness. Of course, we're turned on because we're playing with franchise mode settings. But you could turn this off, and what it means is all bodies of water will stay clean. So essentially, you no longer need to have the water treatment plants to keep your water clean. You no longer need to have those touching your water body in order to keep that way. So quite useful if you don't want to constantly keep plopping the water treatment. We also have enable animal defecation. Pretty self-explanatory. They're not going to poop all around your habitat, so it's going to mean less work for your keepers as well. Enable animal temperature need. Again, you could plop something like a polar bear into a tropical environment, turn this off, and they're not going to sweat, and you don't need to put in all of the coolers and things like that. So yeah, it's up to you if you want to play with that. I never really do. I think putting in a polar bear, you want it to be around ice, otherwise it looks a little bit strange. But these two are two of the ones that I do play with if I'm going super creative. So enable animal terrain need. So if I turn this, actually let's just apply our settings. You see these will come back to normal. Let's go back into here. We'll turn off animal terrain need. We'll click apply. We'll click OK. And then let's just click on here. And you can see now space is greyed out. But in addition to that, so is the terrain distributions here. So they're all brown. So it means if you have an animal that hates long grass, but you really want a habitat with long grass in it, you could now do that. Or you don't have to have as much snow or rock or whatever it might be. So that gives you much more flexibility in terms of designing the habitat the way you want it to look. I think a lot of the time it is nice to follow these because it makes sense for the animals, and obviously Frontier have put these in for a reason because it's the way the animals like it, but sometimes I just want a bit more long grass, you know. So we can do that without upsetting the animals just through this one simple setting here. Now the next one is probably my most favoured one, enable animal plant need. So I'm not going to turn it on just yet. I'm actually going to go over to our llama habitat. So let's head on over there because I know that I stretched the boundaries of what the game is meant to do in this habitat, and potentially the llamas aren't super happy about it. So let's come into here. We can see in environment, we've got slightly too many plants, and we've also got plant type and coverage is severely inappropriate. Now that's because I put some long grass in here, which aren't part of grassland, temperate, taiga, or indeed South Central America. So they think that these are highly inappropriate. We've also got a common ash tree, which is actually outside of their boundary, which they're complaining about, probably because the leaves spill over very slightly. Now, the one thing to bear in mind with this as well is, like I said to you, this really doesn't affect their welfare that much. So actually their nutrition isn't great, which we probably want to correct. So let's go to the gate. We'll come into here. I'm going to change their food quality up to grade 3. So they should stop complaining about that. But you see in habitat here, plants is at 0%, but it's only down to 71, so it's still in the green. The animal's still generally happy, so it's really not that bad from that sense. If you click on the habitat here though, yeah, they're complaining about the view. I was going to say sometimes you do get guests that complain about the plants being inappropriate or there's too many plants in here. But frankly, it doesn't really change their experience or impact their happiness that much. So you can stretch those boundaries without using this setting. But that being said, if you want to go extreme and we wanted to put up 90% plant coverage in here, it might affect it a little bit more. So let's come into here, enable animal plant need. Let's just turn that off. We'll click apply, click OK. And then you'll see all of a sudden coverage, there's no bar on it now, there's no restrictions. Let's come back into overview of the animal. Might need to click play for this to warm up. That's shot up to 97%, and habitat, you can still see plants is at 0, so you can still see how well you're actually adhering to the game mechanics, but it's not affecting the animal whatsoever. So that is a very useful setting, and probably my number one setting when it comes to building a full sandbox zoo, because the plant restrictions can be pretty restrictive. And then finally we've got enable hard shelter, so you could turn this off if you don't want to put a hard shelter in a habitat. Or maybe you've built a hard shelter out of materials that the game sometimes doesn't recognise as actually being a roof because it's not construction pieces in that sense. So you can turn that off there and then the animals won't complain. We've also got enable food spoiling, which I think is quite useful as well. You often see sometimes platters of food which have that sort of smoky green texture about it. I'm going to see if I can find any in the zoo. And perhaps we're maybe not feeding our animals enough, I'm not too sure, but I can't find a single one around the entire zoo. So never mind, but when you get that sort of nasty green kind of, it looks like the food's gone off, you could get rid of that by disabling food spoiling here. So the final part in animal welfare is general welfare. These are very self-explanatory. Enable protesters, no one likes those. You could easily get rid of those in Sandbox. Enable inspections, if you don't want those inspectors to periodically come around and give you a grade and tell you what you've done horrifically wrong. You could turn that off. I'm going to skip one, I'm going to come back to that. Enable barrier dilapidation, so again you could turn this off and then your mechanics aren't going to be required to go around and repair all of the barriers all of the time. So again, if you're trying to get nice shots and you've got lots of holes in your wire mesh barrier around your monkey habitat, or lemur habitat as we do in FewZoo quite often, then you could turn this off and that won't be a problem anymore. And then the final one, which is what we are going to be using today, is if turned off, animals will no longer be able to escape their habitats. Apply, apply, apply. So as you know, if you've watched this series, FewZoo has had a lot of problems with lemurs escaping, with penguins escaping, raccoons now escaping as well. And it's not because they can't come out of their habitat. So, you know, we'll click on a penguin here, we'll go to our heat map, we can check, there's no escape points, it's absolutely fine. Same goes for our lemur habitat over here as well. So when you click on this, there aren't any escape points in this habitat, so they should not be able to escape. But there are sometimes bugs whereby if you put climbing apparatus too close to the habitat walls, then they kind of glitch through it and they manage to get out that way, which is exactly what has happened with our lemurs. So we can fix that by turning off escapes. And if there are escape points, it will still show on the heat map. So I'm going to show you that in just a second when we come on to build our swan habitat, because we're going to be using that. It's really going to be useful for something like our swan habitat here, because I don't want to be putting barriers in and amongst this lake. And of course we can't really have them roaming around this habitat, and I don't really want to fence in the entire lake, for example. I want them to be a bit more like they've landed and lived on this lake naturally, as opposed to being an animal that's been imported and cared for by the zoo. So that's what we're going to be doing here, and we'll be using no escapes to put in invisible barriers to keep them in this area, but without having to have actual live physical barriers which look awful going across the middle of our lake. So yeah, let's come on to guest settings now. So some of these you will see in franchise mode as well. So limit number of guests, you can choose to do that, and then you can choose exactly how many your maximum guests are. So I have done this and limited it to 2,500. Because obviously the more guests you start getting in your zoo and it gets bigger, the more issues you're going to have with frame rate, frankly. So that's why I do this, is just to stop so many sims coming into the zoo and try and preserve my frame rate and gameplay a little bit better. We've also then got enable guest happiness, energy, hunger, thirst, toilet need, very self-explanatory. You can turn all of these off and keep your guests super happy. Obviously the happiness one overrides all of these, so they're going to be 100% happy whether they need the toilet, food, etc, whatever. So if you didn't want to place any toilets in your zoo, you could do that. Again, if you're, for example, building a safari park, maybe you don't want to have toilets all round it, so you could turn that off and then you wouldn't need them. You've also got the option to maximise guest education here, so you could do that and then you wouldn't be required to have billboards or conservation boards, the speakers, tours, anything like that. So again, that's another setting you could play with. And then we've got enable vandalism and pickpockets. So if you don't want to have crime in your zoo, you could turn these off and that's not going to happen. With vandalism as well, there is an easy way to sort of fix this. If you come into the main zoo menu, go to zoo overview and then to crime, you can see what objects have been vandalised. So here I can see there's a bin. I'm just going to click replace and it's done. We don't really get too much. We have got 27 pickpocket victims though, so maybe we need a few more security guards in our zoo. But of course we could turn those off now with the settings here. You've then got increased guest stay, so they'll stay in your zoo for longer, only leaving early when they're unhappy or out of money. So that's quite a nice one to do instead of it just being like they feel like they're done for the day and they'll leave. You've also got infinite guest cash as well, so they're not going to need to go to cash points and they're going to be able to spend freely and not run out of money and then hence leave the zoo. So those are two useful settings if you want to kind of maximise how much money you're taking in. We've got enable guest fleeing, so if a lion escaped from their habitat, for example, the guests are not going to run away from it. Interesting. It also means, if, again, I'm going to go back to my safari park example, if you wanted to create a real-life African savanna, you could turn this off and then guests aren't going to run away if they suddenly encounter a lion, for example. So, yeah, that could be useful if you're trying to do that type of thing. We've got enable litter. That could be one to turn off because frankly it's quite annoying when they throw rubbish on the ground when there's a bin right next to them. So you've got the option to turn that off, and then enable negative effect of facilities on guest happiness. This is another big one that I usually turn off if I'm doing a sandbox zoo because frankly if I've hidden a staff room, I'm going to show you an example of this actually in this zoo here. So we've got our food court over here. The guests cannot see any staff facilities at all from this point. They are all hidden away because they are hidden away in this path down here. We have a staff room in there and we also have an electricity point. Now, because the staff room is there, its bubble, kind of the negative effect bubble around it, if we go to our little heat map here, you can see it's really small because there's loads of scenery around it, but it almost acts like a cylinder. So these guests actually queuing for the toilet or going into the toilet up here are negatively infected by the hidden staff room at the bottom down here, which I don't really appreciate because they would never know it was there. So again, if I'm building a sandbox zoo, that's certainly a setting that I might choose to turn off just so you can be a little bit more flexible with your staff buildings and not have to worry about that radius. And you can do things like this, like put a staff room underneath a guest area and there won't be any issues. So coming on to the next, which is economy settings. Now, I had a few people ask me how I set up franchise mode settings in Sandbox. And this was how. So when I first opened the Sandbox game, I came into these settings here. I enabled cash, I enabled conservation credits, and then set the amount to the amount that I wanted to start with. So you can see here, this is obviously the value that we have in it at the moment. What you could do is, I'm not going to because I don't want to ruin the game, but you could change it so I could suddenly lower myself down to 500,000 if I wanted to. Or I could turn off cash altogether and have unlimited cash. Again, same thing with conservation credits as well. So you've got the flexibility to change those there. But yeah, if you start a sandbox game and you want to play with money and conservation credits, come into here and you can choose how much money you want to start with and how many conservation credits you want to start with as well. We then also have power everything. This is another really useful thing if you don't want to constantly keep plopping in the generators of solar power or things like that around your zoo everywhere. Or if you've got a certain small area that you really don't want to put a generator in but it really needs power, you could choose to select this option and then everything will be powered and it won't cost you anything. So you have to bear in mind as well with this and with the guest settings as well. So if you take away that hunger thirst, they're not going to shop, so you're not going to get the income from that. So if you are playing with money, I would kind of recommend to leave the guest settings on. I would also leave on power everything as well so that you've got a little bit more of a challenge. Otherwise it's going to become very easy to play with money. You've also got enable facility maintenance, so that means that your mechanics will have to go round to your utilities, to your transport rides, your vending machines, whatever it might be, and actually maintain them. And things like toilet cleanliness as well. So you could turn that off so you're not having to maintain anything and the cleanliness will never go down. So there's so many settings in here you can choose to really shape your zoo. The final category is staff settings, and these can be quite useful. So enable staff happiness degradation, you could just turn that off and your staff will always be happy. Energy, again, you could turn that off and they're never going to need to go to a staff room to rest. I do find that that takes a little bit away from the gameplay. I might make them happy, maybe, but I'm probably not going to take away that energy because I feel like sometimes, you know, the staff going to and from staff rooms changing stuff, having those like kind of work rotas essentially, where you've got an extra vendor for your food court in case the other vendors go off on their break. I quite like that sort of thing. So yeah, that's up to you. Obviously, if you're not bothered about that and you don't want to play with that, you've got the option there. And you've also got the option to stop staff from quitting, which can be quite useful as well, particularly if they're not very happy. But again, the way I like to play with the game a bit, so I want to make sure my staff are happy, are trained, fully rested, getting the staff room facilities that they need, so I always leave that on. Then at the bottom here you do have fully trained staff. My warning to you, do not use this if you are playing with money right from the start of your zoo, because you will not be able to afford it. So obviously fully trained staff come with much higher paychecks. So it can be better in terms of their stress levels, their training, obviously, the speed at which they do things to have them fully trained, but it's going to cost you so much more. So don't start a zoo with money on with that. If you're going for unlimited money, by all means do that. And then you're not going to have to worry about checking staff essentially to see if they need training, if they need to be promoted, that sort of thing. So it can be useful if that's the gameplay style you want to go for. But yeah, definitely don't fully train your staff. Make sure that is ticked off when you start your sandbox game, otherwise it's going to cost you an absolute bomb if you're playing with money. And then we've got enable staff fleeing, so they won't run away from escaped animals, pretty self-explanatory. And the final setting, enable research. So again, in this zoo, because we're playing like a franchise, I wanted to research everything. So when we get a new animal, we have to research to unlock all of their enrichment items and that sort of thing. You could turn this off and then you won't have to enable research. It will also mean with mechanic research as well, everything will be unlocked right from the start. So you're not having to research the different themes to get all of those different building pieces and that sort of thing as well. So it can be pretty useful if you're wanting to play creatively in sandbox mode. I will just briefly, before I move on to talking about the Swan Habitat, just talk about these game settings again. I mentioned this in the first episode, but these are quite important, and this is how I always play, with disabled scenery collision, track collision, terrain collision, and disable animal navigation terrain constraints as well. So that allows terrain to be manipulated through existing habitat barriers and enrichment items. This just makes it much easier to build, and particularly when you come to do the transport lines, that disabled track collision, really important, so it can be built through existing scenery or terrain. Otherwise you're going to get issues and you won't be able to build it. I know a lot of people asked about that. You can also here enable global vertical snapping, so that everything you build will be on a 1 meter vertical height, which does make it a lot easier if you're a beginner to align things to buildings and paths and that sort of thing. So you may want to consider playing with that when you first start. I find it a little bit limiting when you get to more advanced things, because you want to place things exactly, so it might be a case of coming in, turning it on and off over time, but that can be quite useful. And you do also have disabled multi-axis movement handles here. So there was an update, I want to say about a year, maybe 2 years ago, where they introduced the multi-handle movement, and by that, I'm just going to cancel this, I mean when you click on an object here and we click X to move it, we can actually move it in 2 directions at once, so like that. So if you disable it, you'll just be able to move it on the red, the green and the blue line individually, and not red and green, for example, like so. So if you're finding that a little bit frustrating, that's how you turn it off in the game settings over here. Alright, let's add in a habitat. So we're going to be doing swans, as I mentioned over here. So the first thing I do want to do is use a null barrier to outline the area that we're going to have the swans in. So I'm actually going to run it all the way up the edge of this path here. So we'll just add this in pretty rough like this. And I'm actually thinking maybe we let them come out underneath this bridge just a little bit, maybe up to this point. We'll come across here, swing back around across this bank, and then we're going to come all the way around our viewing platform here. Now, I just want to shout out Michael W again for this wonderful idea of putting the swans here, because we do already have this kind of not really used viewing platform. So I think this is a really nice thing to do here. We're going to join it actually into the back of the raccoon habitat, this side, and then I'm going to extend the barrier on out this way. So we'll click on this corner, we're going to click plus here to add in a barrier, and we'll come across this way pretty much up to here. I'm going to see how we're going to be able to fit in a gate in just a second, and then across like so. Now again, I'm going to join it into the barrier of the ape island, primate island, whatever we want to call it there, And then we're going to come onto this section, add in a new barrier, and then start coming across our lake here. So the swans are going to have a massive area to be in. But like I said, we're going to be using sandbox settings for this because obviously I'm putting in a null barrier here. In franchise mode, this would not keep the swans in. You're going to get constant swans have escaped warnings, and it's going to be super duper duper annoying. So we're going to run it up here. We're going to run it all the way around the restaurant as well so that guests in the restaurant could have some nice views potentially of swans on the water right next to them, which I think would be really nice. And then we'll finish off the habitat boundary there. So this is going to be where the swans are kept in. So before we do anything, let's get in our habitat gate. So you still need that regardless of any settings. There are no settings to say, I don't want a habitat gate. So that just kind of is what it is, unfortunately. But we can place this one in here. And now with this setting of no escapes as well, let's find our mute swans in here. When we come into the habitat settings here, you see it says grade 1, more than 1.25. You can actually ignore that with no escapes because obviously regardless of what the barrier is, whether it's null, whether it's fixed, how tall it is, what grade it is, they're not going to be escaping at all. So this now doesn't actually matter. But because it's a low barrier, we can afford to put in a low gate in reality. So that's what we're going to go for here. We're just going to go for the small wooden gate habitat. And I think we will place it in here because it's going to join into our existing path network. In fact, we could actually do it this side. Let's do that because that'll be a little bit more hidden. So we can see that that's joined in because we do have this extension to the path corner here. So that is now correctly joined. And what we can then do, I'll click play. We'll go into our animals. Let's filter it to mute swans. And we're going to select all of them. Now I have actually got 7 males and 7 females in here. You can have a massive population of mute swans. So actually if I just come in and show you in the Zoopedia here, then they're not endangered. They're pretty common species, least concern. You can see here on their group size, you can have up to 50 of them. So we've got 14 at the moment, and you can have, you know, anywhere up to 25 males, 25 females if you want. You could have a bachelor group, a female bachelor group. Guests can also enter the habitat as well, so they're confident with guests. They're not going to be entering the habitat in this case, it will be next to the path. Obviously we don't need to worry about guests kind of overcrowding them or stressing them out because they are confident. So yeah, my point being we can have really large groups. So we've got 14 swans to start off with. Let's come back into our animals. We'll select all of those up here. Now I have actually moved them all into quarantine. So we're going to filter on quarantine because I know our quarantine was actually full with 14 swans in there. So let's select just the ones in quarantine. We're going to say move here and we're going to bring them into the habitat, and then we can move the others in just a second. So those swans are going to come in here now, and then I'm going to show you what happens to the boundaries once they're in. Okay, so all of our swans have passed quarantine. They're all in the habitat now. I have added a new keeper with a work zone for the mute swans, with the staff room here and the keeper hut actually just inside the raccoon and skunk habitat. I thought they could share that. No problems at all. So they've got facilities nice and close. So let's just have a little look. I'll click pay here. With the swans, let's click on one of them. We'll go to our heat map and you'll see if we go to habitat, loads and loads of escape points. But because we come back into sandbox settings, let's scroll all the way down in animal settings, enable escapes is off. They are never going to escape here. So it is nice because you can still see and you can still create habitats to make sure animals are actually enclosed. So you can still see that data here, even with that setting off. So it doesn't limit you to creating actually habitats which do adhere to boundaries and barrier constrictions, because you can still obviously see where there are escape points, but what it does mean is they're just not going to escape. So it makes it super useful, and yeah, means that we now don't have to have a physical barrier in the water here to keep the swans down this end, which is the big thing that I really, really wanted to avoid with this habitat, because I definitely don't want them going all the way around here and would have to have a barrier around our little monkey island. It's just not what I want the zoo to look like at all. Like I said, I want it to seem like the swans are living here pretty naturally, as opposed to it actually being a zoo habitat in that sense and kind of placed and managed within the zoo. So the next thing we obviously want to do is get a vet researching them. So let's put Jonathan onto the mute swans and we'll get that research up hopefully nice and quickly. And then if we just have a quick look at them as well, so their welfare is on pretty much 0 right now. Obviously we haven't even placed a food plate in or anything to that description. So let's come into our habitat, we'll filter on mute swans, and then we can place down things like the food bowl large. Now the trouble here is I can't change any of these banks because if I remove the water source, it won't go back in because of the way we've put paths over it and barriers around it. So that is one slight frustration. So we're going to have to work with the banks how they are and not kind of shape the terrain, but that's okay. It's not the end of the world. But we definitely want to get some of these enrichment items in to keep the swans happy, obviously. So I'm thinking because we've got our viewing platform here, we'll make this the sort of main space for their food and that sort of thing. So we'll add in the food bowl over there. They don't necessarily need a water pipe because they have got the clean water source of the lake, so that should be okay. And you can check that in here. Obviously, hydration being 100% means they're not going to require a water pipe or a water trough of any sort. Social's fine. Obviously, they've got plenty of space on the terrain. Way more water, way more land than they actually need. We haven't really got these right, so what we can do is come in and change some of the grass around here to make it shorter, less of the long grass we want to, or of course we could go into the sandbox settings and turn off animal terrain need if we don't want to do too much of that, but I'm going to still adhere to it. So really the only setting here that I'm going to turn off is that animal escapes one. And then plants, interestingly, we don't have too many plants that aren't actually within their sort of comfort zone anyway, so that's not too bad, and they can have pretty high coverage here, so we can go a little bit crazy outside the front of these houses decorating this up when we come to it in just a second. So that should be fine. They do need a hard shelter though, so we're going to have to add in some form of shelter for them. So I'm going to come on to that in the detailing. I'm not entirely sure what I might do. It might be that we actually turn off the hard shelter need setting to avoid that potentially, but I think we'll try and do something. So I'll come back at the end and talk about what we've done there. I think for now, because we've done a lot of habitat design and there's not really too much to do in here other than polishing up a few banks in this area around here, a little bit of fencing between the guests and the bank over this side. We're going to finish it off in a quick time lapse and then we'll come back at the end. We'll have a look, see how the settings have changed, what's been implemented, and wrap up the episode there.
You might be the one that truly got me. I feel it too. You might be the one that truly got me. I feel it too. I feel it too. You might be the one that truly got me. You might be the one that truly got me. I feel it too. You might be the one that truly got me. I feel it too. I feel it too. You might be the one that truly got me. I feel it too.
So our swans are in, and it's actually really pleasant watching them float around, although my issue is that they don't actually go over to this little section of their habitat. So if we just take a massive zoom out, you can see they've obviously got their bank area here, where I did add in the hard shelter requirement for them in the form of this very mediocre kind of rain port on the back of these buildings here. I did add in some sort of stone tiling to act a little bit like a pavement around it, which I thought was quite a nice effect as well. And then we've obviously got some longer grass and some reeds and some rock work around the edges, which is quite nice. It sort of forms little steps up, and you can see them here. They actually walk on these rocks just in the water around here, which is super cool to see around the forage pool. And guests are using the viewing platform to watch them as well, which is really, really nice. They also seem to be standing back here to watch into, which isn't going to be the best view, but there we go. I did also add in just a basic shelter over here, because apparently this wasn't quite enough for 14 swans, although I find that a little bit hard to believe. So it has turned into, anyway, more of a zoo habitat than a natural swan environment, but there we have it. They're having fun at least. And they do kind of swim around out here, but they haven't quite made it over to this section yet. It's where we've just added in a few more enrichment. I've been very careful not to add in food enrichment over here, because the issue with this is clearly that the keeper gate is over this side, and the keeper within the habitat cannot access this piece of land here. Now obviously in reality they'd be able to just hop the fence here and do any cleaning that they want to, but within the game does not allow that. So what we do need to do in Sandbox settings as well, to make sure, just in case the swans do eventually make it over to this side, we're going to come into animal settings, and we are going to turn off animal defecation, hit apply for that, because then if the swans do come over here, they're not going to poop, and therefore there is no reason actually for the keepers to need to be over this side unless a swan is injured, but in that case we can usually move them, so it's not too much of a problem. But yeah, if they poop over here and they can't clean it, then it's going to be quite a nasty sight for the guests, so we'll turn off defecation, and then that way our little habitat with invisible barriers and no escaping actually functions pretty nicely. So yeah, a couple of little sandbox settings there that you can use to create a habitat of this kind of description. Even if it's split across two areas and the keeper can't reach one area, just don't put any food in there for the keeper to need to maintain. Turn off defecation and you're all set. So yeah, there we have it. We'll just go in here and we can admire the guest's view from out this side, which I think is really quite nice, actually, looking down here with the trees now. The swans on the bank across to the primate island, and then of course across there into the restaurant. I'm pretty pleased with this. And again, another shout out to Michael W for that wonderful idea of putting the swans in around our kind of defunct viewing platform before. I absolutely love it. Thank you very much. So we do now have one more episode to go of the Zoob's Guide, where I'm going to be answering a whole bunch of your questions. So let me know if you do have questions. Drop them into the comments below and I'll add them to the list for the final kind of Q&A session. If there are any other topics that you feel haven't been answered here or burning questions like that, again, drop those in and we'll cover those all off in the last episode of this series. But for today, that is going to be it. So if you have enjoyed the episode, likes, comments and shares are really greatly appreciated. And while you wait for new content, check out one of the videos on screen. But that is all from me for now. So I'll catch you again next time. Bye bye.